Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi. I'm the treasurer for ColumbiaDC and graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. This evening, we are very honored to have Timothy Frye, Marshall D. Shulman, Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy at Columbia University, to talk to us about Russia and Russian politics in the time of war, and particularly their weak strongman, Vladimir Putin. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speaker, but I do encourage everyone to check our website for his full bio. Professor Frye earned a BA in Russian language and literature from Middlebury College, and an MA and PhD from Columbia, PhD in Columbia in political science. He taught at OSU for 8 years before returning to Columbia in 2006. Professor Frye worked on a cultural exchange program for the United States Information Agency in 6 cities in the Soviet Union in the late 80s, and advised the Russian Securities and Exchange Commission in the 90s. He directed the Harriman Institute at Columbia from 2009 to 2015, and also co-directed a research laboratory at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow from 2011 to 2022. He's the editor of Post-Soviet Affairs. He serves as a member of the Scholars Council at the United States Library of Congress, and also author of many books, including the forthcoming and exciting Workplace Politics: How Politicians and Employers Subvert Elections. Professor, when the book is ready, we're going to contact you. We would like to host a book talk. This is the talk of the town now, as you know. Without further ado, Professor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. So I want to talk about how I approach studying Russia as evidenced in the book Weak Strongman that I wrote in 2021. And I want to ask, is it still useful to think about Putin as a weak strongman? And I'll talk about what that argument entails in a second. But first, I want to differentiate the book from a lot of works on Russia. So most works on Russia fall into 2 categories. Many books focus on Putin, and the argument is that if we want to understand Russia, we need to understand Vladimir Putin. This makes sense. Russia is an autocracy. Putin is obviously the most important political player. So if we want to understand Russian politics, we need to recognize that Putin is an ex-KGB man who does judo, who has little interest in markets and democracy, is out to reward his cronies and to consolidate his power. And this kind of Putinology view of Russian politics suggests that Russian politics are really an extension of Vladimir Putin's worldview, his values, his background, and his seeming omnipotence. And that Russia is the way it is right now because that's the way Putin is. But Russia has 146 million people. It extends across 11 time zones. So reducing Russia's complex politics to a single man helps, but doesn't get us very far. Moreover, Putin behaves like a typical autocrat in many ways. So even dictators who don't do judo, don't have a KGB background, don't run around with their shirts off, engage in a lot of the same activities that Putin does, the way they censor the media, the way they undermine elections, the way they use corruption in order to consolidate their power. So in this way suggests that maybe trying to understand Russian politics through the lens of Vladimir Putin has some shortcomings. Another view suggests that we need to think about contemporary Russian politics as a reflection of the Tsarist and Soviet past. That the heavy hand of Tsarist rule and communist power has so distorted the economy and the society that Russia is unique in many ways. And certainly that's true, in the way that all countries are unique. In the strongest variant, we see Russians treated as a homo sovieticus, a uniquely post-Soviet mentality that favors learned helplessness and wants a strong hand to rule the country. And this argument suggests that Russia is the way it is because that's the way Russians are. Russia has always been an aggressive country with little respect for the rule of law. However, when we look at individual Russians' political attitudes, they're as varied as in any country. And we need to be careful about relying on cultural stereotypes like this. Moreover, Russian history is not a straight line. We can find periods in which Russia has opened itself to the West and periods in which it tried to isolate itself. We've seen periods where Russia centralizes power and periods where Russia decentralizes power. So we can go back into Russia's rich history and find parallels for all kinds of things, which makes it difficult to use Russia as a guide to Russian politics. So we can learn enormously about Russian history, and it's really important to understand Vladimir Putin as an individual. But rather than treating Putin as a unique leader in a unique country, I tend to focus on Russia's type of government. Russia is a personalist autocracy, and personalist autocracies behave differently than one-party autocracies like we see in China or the Soviet Union, or military dictatorships like we saw in Chile or in contemporary Myanmar. Personalist autocrats are ruled by a single individual who make the major decisions about policy and personnel. And what makes these countries interesting is that leaders face two threats. They can be removed by a revolt by the masses or by a coup by the elites. And the problem that personalist dictators face is that they can't reduce both of these threats at the same time. Typically, reducing one of these threats makes the other one more severe. So you can direct funding towards social welfare programs and keep the masses off the street, but that means you're cutting funding for your elite cronies. So that's just one kind of example. And leaders in these personalist autocracies rule by a mixture of personal popularity, performance, propaganda. And they try to avoid repression as largely counterproductive, but they have fairly weak tools to try to balance these competing threats. Right? Personalist autocracies are known for their weak institutions. Courts are weak, parties are weak, parliaments are weak. And this really increases the cost of losing power for personalist autocrats like Putin. So between 1946 and 2012, 70% of personalist autocrats lost power either by a coup or by a mass revolt. And 80% of personalist autocrats who lost office ended up in jail, in exile, or dead. In contrast, in military-led regimes, leaders can go back to the military. In Communist Party-led regimes, they can go back, or in one-party regimes, they can go back to positions in the party. So they have a soft landing pad. And that doesn't happen for personalist autocrats. And this really shapes politics because it really raises the stakes of losing office, right? Moreover, personalist autocrats often have great difficulty getting accurate information about what's going on in society or among the elite. The elites have lots of incentives to flatter the autocrat and to distort information to make themselves look good, and the public is often reluctant to reveal their true levels of opposition to the autocrat, instead giving great praise to the autocrat publicly, while back home in their kitchens, they're criticizing him. Finally, all personalist autocrats face really difficult trade-offs, right? Cheat too little on elections and risk losing office, cheat too much and signal weakness. Use corruption to reward your cronies, but not so much that it stunts economic growth and leads to protest. Manipulate the news, but not so much that people distrust the media. Repress your political opponents, but not so much that there is a popular backlash. keep the security services strong, but not so strong that they can turn on you. Moreover, we see that in cross-national research, personalist autocracies have a lot of the features that we see in Russia. Personalist autocracies tend to have slower rates of economic growth, more volatile economic policies, higher levels of corruption. They're more likely to engage in foreign conflict than countries that are led by either a single party or by military-led regimes. So we see these patterns in personalist autocracies, such as we see in Turkey or Kazakhstan or Belarus or Chavez's Venezuela. Even Hungary's Orban can, I think, usefully be declared as a personalist autocracy. So where we see these patterns existing across countries with very different cultures at different levels of development, it suggests that there's not that that we can learn something by looking outside of Russia and by looking beyond Putin's worldview and by looking beyond Russian history. Well, those are obviously important. So I wrote the book, and it came out in 2021. And many people have asked me, is Putin still a weak strongman? Is he strong enough to hold on to power, but too weak to govern effectively? And I think that there's still a lot of merit in looking at Russia through this lens. I don't think it helps us understand Putin's decision to launch the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion in February of 2022. Leaders in foreign policy tend to be particularly important. Even in democracies, the individual characteristics of leaders are more important in foreign policy than in domestic policy. And in terms of international crises, the individual characteristics of leaders, I think, matter much more so. And even if we look within the Russian elite, there are many Russian elites that are skeptical of the West in Putin's inner circle. But even among those in Putin's inner circle, he is the one who has the greatest fixation with Ukraine. His writings on Ukraine history, his insistence that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. This is something that he emphasizes far more than anyone else in his inner circle, particularly prior to the war. He was really the main person propagating this point of view. So, I can't say that the approach that I take is helpful in understanding the decision to launch the war. That seems something really more unique to Putin. But I think it helps understand some other aspects of the way that the war has been fought. I think it helps us understand the really significant information problems that the Kremlin has faced in launching this war. The expectation was that Ukraine would be a short, victorious war, that the Ukrainian army would lay down their arms, Zelensky would flee, the Germans would hem and haw, but ultimately they would keep buying Russian gas in large volumes. The US might levy sanctions, but otherwise they would look the other way and recognize that this issue mattered a lot more to the Kremlin than it did to the White House. Now, those miscalculations are rooted, I think, in the kinds of information that informational problems that we see in informational autocracies, where people are largely unwilling to tell the boss bad news. Moreover, I put an emphasis on weak institutions, and I think this helps us understand the poor performance of the Russian army. We know that the corruption within the Russian army has been greater than it's had a greater effect on warfighting than we expected. And I'm reminded of a comment by Anthony Bourdain, who said that if you go to a restaurant and the bathrooms are dirty, you should really ask yourself what the kitchen looks like, because the bathroom is the part of the restaurant that they let you see. And in the same way that when we look at the Russian state and we see the parts of it that we can see and they don't work particularly well, we shouldn't assume that the parts of the Russian state that we can't see, such as the security service and the Russian military, work very effectively. So I think the kind of governance problems that I cited earlier have really come up in spades in the full-scale war in Ukraine. Moreover, the balancing act that Putin has to face between satisfying the elites and the masses, I think, is even more challenging now than it was prior to the invasion. Putin has lost his main trump card. The great key to Putin's success is his ability to say to the Russian people that he has returned a degree of stability and predictability to their lives after the chaos of the first decade of the transition. But the invasion of Ukraine has thrown that all to the wind. Moreover, the war was launched without elite buy-in. You know, it was a surprise invasion, and just as it caught many Ukrainians off guard, it also caught many members of the Russian elite off guard. If you remember, on the eve of the full-scale invasion, Putin held two meetings, one with the security services and one with the business elite, that were broadcast on Russian television, where basically Putin compelled these elites to publicly support the decision to invade Ukraine. But their statements of support look more like hostage statements than genuine enthusiasm for the decision. Moreover, if we think about the Prigozhin mutiny of 2023, other elites did not rise to Putin's defense until it was clear that the mutiny would fail. And if we think about other personalist autocracies, we often see very high levels of distrust among members of the inner circle because they're all competing for power. They're all competing for the ear of the dictator. And in some sense, they're all competing to replace the dictator. Being the president of Russia is a good job. Many people would like to have it. And there are no institutions that can protect even the physical security of members of the elite who fall afoul of the autocrat, right? So there's a lot of distrust among the Russian elite. Moreover, we know that sanctions have hurt the business elite. They haven't had as much effect on Putin's inner circle of security officers because many of them were already under sanctions, and they don't have the same kind of business exposure that the business elites do. And while the economic situation is stable for the moment, much of the stabilization of the current period is due to a spending down of the rainy day fund and a huge influx of government spending, so that the economic growth that we've seen in the last year, on paper of 2-3%, by some estimates as high as 3.5 or 4, it's largely driven by government spending rather than by efficiency gains or by innovation, right? And I think the bigger concern among many of the elites is that the increasing isolation that Russia faces in the world is hardly a recipe for economic success in the 21st century. Also, the public has not quite been sold on the invasion either. I want to put up a couple of slides here if I can. Let's see. So along with 3 colleagues and a grant from the National Science Foundation, we've been conducting surveys in Russia, and we conducted 3 waves of a survey where we interviewed the same individuals at 3 points in time: in August, September 2021, after Duma elections, in December 2021, kind of on the eve of the full-scale invasion, and then we interviewed them again in October 2023. These are face-to-face interviews done by Levada Center using a nationally representative sample. I can talk a lot about whether or not people are lying, perhaps in the question and answer section. But I think the important thing to recognize is that we have a pretty good idea about the direction of the bias in a lot of these answers, as you'll see. So in October 2023, we asked a very straightforward question of our Russian respondents. Do you support or not support the continuation of the special military operation in Ukraine? And what we see is that 43% of Russians answered yes. 33% answered no, I don't support the continuation of the special military operation in Ukraine. And about 22% said it was hard to say or they refused to answer. So despite the great efforts of the Kremlin to rally the public behind the special military operation, it doesn't seem to be a great enthusiasm. Now, this isn't to say that there's much opposition to the war in Ukraine. Publicly expressing opposition to the war is a very risky business in Russia, and even minor expressions of opposition to the special military operations on Facebook or other forms of social media have landed people in jail. But it is to say that Putin's ability to persuade people that this was a great idea doesn't seem to be borne out in the data. Moreover, even if we look among those respondents who support Putin, and I think in this survey about 70% of our respondents said that they support the political activities of Vladimir Putin. About 20% said they don't support, and about 10% said that they do. But even if we look among Putin's supporters, only 54% said that they support the military operation in Ukraine. About a quarter outright say they don't support it, and about another 20% are on the fence. So this suggests a couple of things. One, that there's, even among Putin supporters, there's considerable subgroups who are skeptical about the war in Ukraine. It also suggests that Putin is drawing his support from policies other than the war effort. So that might be a sign that Putin has reserves of support that are unrelated to the war, but it also tells us that the war is a political problem for President Putin. And the group of respondents who are mostly anti-war but pro-Putin, they tend to be women, younger respondents, those who have a favorable view of the West, those who've had economic difficulties, or who have lost their job due to the war. And in general, we see that those whose economic fortunes have suffered have tended to be much less enthusiastic about the war effort. And again, we find that about 41% of Russians, when asked in October 2023, said that their financial position had noticeably declined. So while we see great growth in the defense sector and high levels and high wages in many sectors of the economy, as labor shortages have happened during the war, nonetheless, inflation is running at double digits, and for the kinds of goods that core goods that Russians are buying, it's running at much higher rates. And a large portion of the Russian population, in our sample 40%, said that their financial position had declined noticeably since the war began. We also asked this question. Sometimes governments have to make hard choices about how they spend their funds. Is it more important right now for the government to spend on social programs or on military services? And even in the the height of the war, most Russians still think that the government should be spending more on social services rather than on the military. If we look at support for a more bellicose approach to Ukraine prior to the war, in December of 2021, we asked, what should Russia do in its situation with Ukraine? Remember, this is prior to the war. And about 2/3 said that Russia should send humanitarian aid or provide moral support. About 9% said send weapons. About 8% said send armed forces. And about 30% said that Russia should stay out. So this suggests that most Russians were not sold on the idea of a particularly militaristic approach to relations with Ukraine prior to the war. Some other indications of skepticism towards the war are the increasing payments that the Russian government has to make to civilians in order to get them to sign up to fight. So in addition to a roughly $4,000 or $5,000 payment from the federal government, regional governments are also topping off payments to citizens in their region that sign up for the war effort. And these are data that come from January, through the year of 2024. And what we see in the second half of the year, about half of Russian regions increased their one-time payments to get people to join the army. And in some cases, like Moscow and St. Petersburg and Rostov, these increases were quite large, to the order of $10,000 or $15,000 at a kind of rough exchange rate of 100 rubles to the dollar. Moreover, if we look about Russia's ability to keep the economy going at a high rate, primarily by priming the pump through domestic spending, these are data of Russia's national wealth fund. And we see this starts in January 2021. The peak is in July of 2022. This is the period when Europe is buying lots and lots of oil, of gas from Russia. In the second half of the year, Europe stops buying gas from Russia. And in the last year, since January 23 to January 2024, we see that the wealth fund has fallen from around 144 billion to about 55 billion, with a burn rate of about 4 billion per month. So this doesn't mean that even if Russia spends this down, it's going to go bankrupt. But it does mean that it will have to find other sources of economic growth, either economic innovation or efficiency gains, because at the moment, Russia is priming the pump. There's a severe labor shortage, and wages are going up, and they're bringing all factories back online. Shifts are working, 24 hours a day, so they're doing everything they can and getting around 3 or 4% growth. But in the future, that formula is going to have to change because Russia simply won't have the revenue, barring some, big spike in energy prices. So this is all just to show that the balancing act that Putin faces between pumping up the economy and keeping people happy, while also allowing the elites to skim off their share of Russian economic growth, has become more challenging since the war began. So I'll argue that I still think it's helpful to think about Russian politics as a balancing act, but that Putin must face between these competing groups, and that the war has only made that balancing act that much more difficult. So as we look ahead to a post-Putin Russia, certainly personalist autocrats like Putin tend to be replaced by other personalist autocrats. So the likelihood of making a transition to a more competitive open political system is hampered by the fact that Russia is a personalist autocracy. One-party regimes and military regimes have much better chances of transitioning to a more democratic form of government. Moreover, a lot depends on the war. If Russia is able to declare a victory in Ukraine, then that will go a long way to cementing a hardline policy towards Russia and the West. And Putin's successor is likely to come from, within the group of people who share his policy preferences. Moreover, Russia as an empire, former empires often have trouble dealing with their diminished global status. We saw this with France. We saw this with the UK. And I think that will be a problem for Russia going forward. On the other hand, Russia is richer, it's better educated, it's more urban, it's more ethnically homogeneous than lots of other autocracies. And these are all features that would suggest a perhaps brighter future for Russia. And to my mind, if Russia is denied a victory in its war with Ukraine, it'll only help Russia in the long run. So I think I'll leave it at that. I've raised a lot of topics about how to approach studying Russia. I presented a lot of data you might have questions about. And I'll be very interested to hear what you have to say. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome everyone. My name is Miyako Yerrick, and I'm the admin for the ColumbiaDC group. I'm also a Columbia College graduate. So we have a bunch of questions coming in, and I'm his history major, so this is right up my alley. So please continue to put your questions into the Q&A function. We have a bunch already here. So maybe I can start with one on the polling data. So we had a question from Giannis on if you could share the way that you phrased the questions that were asked, and then if you thought at all about also polling Ukraine.
Oh, sure. Great questions. So the questions were translations from Russian into English of the questions. And it's really important to look at question wording. So for example, the Levada Center's question on war support asks, do you support the activities of the armed services of Russia in Ukraine? So it's tapping not only the decision to go into Ukraine, but also support for the boys in Ukraine. So, I think it's not a great question because one could imagine people being skeptical about the war, but wanting to support the troops. So it depends a lot on how the question is asked. Like if you ask, was it a good decision to start the war? That's a very different question from, do you support continuation of the war? Like there are Russians who say, I didn't want to start the war and I wish it hadn't happened, but now that we're in it, we have to win it. So that's very, very important. And I should say that we're not the only ones doing public opinion polling on the war in Russia. There is a group called Russia Watch at Princeton University that are asking 500 Russians every day the same set of questions about the war. And they find tremendous stability in the responses. It basically seems like either you're in the kind of 25% of hardcore supporters of the war, or you're in the 15 to 20% that are hardcore opponents of the war, or you're in that kind of vast majority of Russians who would like to see Russia win, but aren't really willing to sacrifice or pay high costs. So, I remember one interview I saw where a respondent said, the war is very important, we have to win it, but just don't ask me to do anything about it, right? So For a separate project, I'm also doing surveys in Ukraine. And there we're also looking at questions such as how does changes in people's economic situation and exposure to violence shape their support for the war effort and shape their trust in state institutions. And that data is much fresher, and I'm still trying to analyze it. But those are really good questions.
We had a question from Lisa about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Great.
If you have any thoughts there.
Sure. So I'm often asked about the influence of religion in Russian politics. And religion is way more important in US politics than it is in Russian politics, in the sense of how people's beliefs about God and about faith and about church going shape their political behavior. We don't find a lot of evidence that Orthodox believers have sharply different views about the war than non-believers. However, we do see that those with more traditional values about gender roles, about Russia's place in the world, that are more patriotic, they tend to be more supportive of the war effort. Where the Russian Orthodox Church is important, I think, is less at the mass level than at the institutional level. So the Russian Orthodox Church has played a really important role in legitimizing the war in Ukraine. And Putin has relied pretty heavily on the Russian Orthodox Church to kind of bless his actions in Ukraine. And you see all of these kinds of strange alliances between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian military, where you have Russian or leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church holding services for military leaders. And there's a lot of overlap between, and also members of the Russian security services trying to openly display their support for the Russian Orthodox Church. So I think on this level of the Kremlin trying to sell the war, the Russian Orthodox Church is very, very, very important.
And we've had a question about what other countries Putin might have interests in. Does it end with Ukraine? What is it? Maybe just a way to distract the population and kind of coalesce them around a thought. So do you see other regions as potential also targets?
So some people have made the argument that the invasion of Ukraine was driven by Putin's need to distract from domestic problems. I've never been really persuaded by that. I mean, his approval ratings were still at 60%. And Russia's problems in 2019, 2020, 2021 were very manageable. The opposition had largely been sidelined. The economy was very stagnant. There was very little dynamism in Russian society, but things were very stable and could have continued along that, in that vein for a long time. It was really the kind of decision by Putin to launch the war for reasons about his personal legacy, for, I think, reasons about his view that he had accomplished most of his goals, and the one thing that was left unresolved was to, unite Ukraine and Russia in one country. So I don't think it was done for domestic political purposes. Now, looking beyond Ukraine, wars are very dynamic things. And, Mike Tyson has this famous line of, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So, depending on how things go in Ukraine, events on the ground in Ukraine might shape, the way Putin responds to future opportunities. So if it's clear that, NATO won't respond or the West will look the other way, one would be nervous about countries around Russia's borders. But there is also this dynamic element of, if, for example, stray missiles land on NATO territory, and NATO decides to Poland, Romania, even without NATO, decide on their own to escalate. That's a possible scenario that might lead to a broadening of the conflict. I'm not a military expert, but the military experts that I talk to think in its current form, the Russian offensive is unlikely to roll up Ukraine very quickly, barring a collapse of Ukraine and a complete withdrawal of Western support. So the physical constraints on what Russia can do should be taken into account. But we're also thinking about a post-Putin Russia, and if Putin is able to make his name, fulfill his legacy by being the ones who in the Russian tradition of gathering the lands in, Putin's successor might have a similarly aggressive policy towards countries beyond Ukraine as a way to ensconce themselves in the memories of the Russian people. So it's not a static situation, it's a dynamic one.
We've also had a few questions, of course, obviously here in the US, we want to know, well, is there anything that the West could have done to prevent this aggression? Right. There was also talk about, well, this didn't happen under the Trump administration. So does Putin want a Harris continuation so that Trump doesn't come back? So as we think about kind of American politics, the election's obviously coming up. Yeah. Is there something we could have done, and is there something influencing actions now?
Lots of things. So on whether we could have done things differently, I think the Biden administration, in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, behaved actually pretty well. They had intelligence that the invasion was going to happen, and they took really an unprecedented step of sharing that publicly with, privately with the Ukrainian government in much more detail, but also publicly to try to deter Putin from engaging in the war. It's possible that a more concerted effort from Germany and from Europe about how they would respond, might have been a greater deterrent on Russian military action. But some people have argued that the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan sent a signal that the U.S. was pulling back from its international commitments, and that might have tempted Putin into thinking that Ukraine's far away, Afghanistan's far away, the Americans aren't going to care very much about it. But if Putin was really concerned about a foreign threat, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan should have reassured him, right? Rather than emboldened him, which, if anything, it seems to have done. So I largely put the decision on the Kremlin rather than on the actions of the West. Now, Putin, I think, would love having Trump back in the White House as an agent of chaos, as somebody who, in the debate last night was unwilling to say that he hoped Ukraine would win the war. Certainly, any criticisms of Russia's domestic policy and support for opposition forces would be weaker under a Trump presidency than under a Harris presidency. at the same time, the Kremlin was very disappointed in Donald Trump in his time in office. They had very high expectations when he came in about how he could change U.S.-Russian relations, end the sanctions that were in place after the annexation of Crimea, lead to a détente and a cooling of Russian relations, a welcoming back of Russia, from its kind of isolation after the annexation of Crimea. But none of that happened, in part because the U.S. is a system of checks and balances, and Congress was very intent on passing sanctions, and really held Trump's feet to the fire. So while I think the Kremlin would prefer to see Trump in office, I think they have much more realistic expectations this time around, rather than in the prior case.
One of the theories I remember from policy school was that the foreign policy of the United States is fairly consistent, even with the switching back and forth between administrations because of all those checks and balances. So despite kind of what even the president might want to do, there are restrictions there. So we had another question on some of the kind of what you've done on polling for the population. Alan says that Russia has a substantial Muslim population.
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any ideas of their views?
So it's a good question. In order to Russia is roughly 82% Russian. There's small percentage of Ukrainians and Belarusians. So the Muslim populations are, in the aggregate scheme of Russia, relatively small, even as they're concentrated in the southern Siberia and the North Caucasus. And in order to really be able to say anything with confidence about the Muslim populations, you need to do surveys that really target them in a way that we haven't done. Those kinds of surveys are pretty expensive to run, and even the Levada Center doesn't have great coverage in the North Caucasus. They have some regions where they survey, but other regions where they don't. Now, I should say, though, that if we look at things like the war casualties, they're largely coming from the non-Russian parts of the Russian Federation. Tiva, Bashkortostan, Udmurtia, Chechnya, all have disproportionately taken part in the war effort, in part because these regions tend to be much poorer. So the bonuses that they're getting in order to sign up are 5 to 7 times a monthly salary, whereas for a Muscovite, it's much less. There's much less financial incentive to fight. So there's also some, the Muslims in like Chechnya is kind of its own fiefdom, with Kadyrov playing a kind of special role in the Russian military operation, where he is allowed to have his own troops in units in ways that other parts of the non-Russian fighting force is not.
And when you were doing your questions, your polls, you mentioned during your talk that control of the media, control of what information gets out is a big part of it. So
Yes.
Rob asked, to what extent do you think that people in Moscow and St. Petersburg actually understand the realities of what's happening in Ukraine and the effect that war is having on Russia?
Great. So I think for a long time, Russians were largely insulated, particularly in the big cities, from what was going on in Ukraine. And there's certainly the case that people who get their media from social media tend to be less supportive of the war effort, and people who get their news from state media tend to be more supportive. But it's often hard to figure out whether people who are anti-war to begin with use social media, and people who are more pro-regime listen to state media, and would be more pro-war anyways, even without the state media. But I think what the state media has done in Ukraine is provided a narrative that many Russians can hold on to, even as they're skeptical about the war effort, to prevent them from, taking up any kind of opposition to the war. And Putin has done that in two ways. One is to say, and they're almost in tension with each other, where he says, look, this is not a war with Ukraine, this is a war with the West. And the fate of Russia is at stake. This is an existential, crisis. At the same time, he says, don't worry, this is just a special military operation. And, we're not going to need to do mass mobilization, which I know is very unpopular. And, the economy, we're going to keep the economy going. And we're going to ask the Russian people to make as few sacrifices as possible. So that narrative was able, I think, to run for a while. But I think now in the last, 4 to 6 months, the levels of casualties in the war effort are simply becoming too big, I think, for ordinary people to ignore. You have estimates, rough estimates, 120,000 to 150,000 killed and another 300,000 wounded. So, I haven't been in Russia in a long time, but from what I see there, from what I talk to people who have been there, you are seeing, a greater presence of war veterans, that are hard to ignore. And, in other settings, war veterans have, been a very much a, political, lightning rod as people see them. It's hard to ignore the costs of war. Also, the Ukrainians' advance into Kursk is also something that has been widely discussed in the Russian media. And I think it's made a lot of, Russians anxious and nervous. So if we look at things like, not just the public opinion data that I gave you, because, we need to be careful about public opinion data. These are just answers to questions. And reported behavior is often different from actual behavior, right? But if we look at things like birth rates and marriage rates, they tend to be going down. If we look at how much it costs to buy, to pay Russian civilians to fight in the war effort, that's all going up. So if we look at these other kinds of behavioral indicators, they tell us that even as in a binary question, most Russians are willing to say that they approve of Putin's policies. If you push a little bit further and look at other dimensions of behavior, there's a lot more anxiety and war fatigue, and Putin fatigue for that matter, in Russia, certainly than there was compared to, say, the annexation of Crimea, where you did see this genuine wellspring of organic support and rally around the flag.
Well, speaking of Crimea, we've had multiple questions about if we should have pushed back harder against Putin in Crimea. Would it have made a difference now? But then we also have questions on NATO encroachment and,
yes.
So kind of both sides, kind of what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I mean, in diplomacy, there's always a mixture of carrot and stick. There's always a mixture of threats and reassurances in order to get countries to do what you would like them to do. So on the one hand, people have argued that the U.S. should have done more in 2014, beyond the sanctions, beyond creating tighter relations with Ukraine. Now, whether Ukraine was a likely candidate for NATO membership, I think is very much an open question. Germany and France had made it clear that they were not on board with Ukraine joining NATO. Even in 2014, most Ukrainians were skeptical about joining NATO. A majority were against joining NATO, and prior to the annexation, as many Ukrainians wanted, alliance with Russia as they did with the West. It was only the actions of Russia that have really turned the Ukrainian populace into, much stronger supporters of Ukraine joining NATO. So there's also an argument, I think, to be made that Ukraine in 2014, the Ukrainian military was not in a state where weapons would have had the same effect that they've had in 2022. There was tremendous improvement in state institutions in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, so that there were real concerns about the transfer of weapons and whether or not they would fall into the wrong hands and whether they would be effective in 2014, whereas in 2022, the Ukrainian military has been really successful in finding innovative ways to use the hardware that the West has sent in ways that I think have even surprised Western military leaders. Now, whether or not Western encroachment in Ukraine sparked the invasion, well, I think that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, and the Kremlin has simply shrugged its shoulders, suggests that Russia blaming NATO encroachment for the invasion of Ukraine is more likely a scapegoat rather than that allows Russia to do something that it wanted to do, rather than really the driving force for. I thought my sense is that Putin thought this would be a short, victorious war, as in Georgia, and he thought he could get away with it, and that there were domestic political reasons for him to do it that were greater than the international sticks or carrots, however we want to put it.
You mentioned kind of the economy. It's a little bit struggling. Their state is doing a lot to kind of prop it up, but there's these two competing factors of making sure the elites get paid as well as the people get supported. So do you think one of those giving would be a bigger issue? And how does Putin intend to kind of balance those to keep the war effort going?
So, Putin's been really fortunate. So, I steal from a colleague who said that Russia's had Peter the Great, Ivan the Terrible, and Vladimir the Lucky. In that Putin came to power in 1998, and Russia had just gone through a horrible financial crisis. Its currency was devalued, so its exports were very attractive. Oil prices surged shortly after Putin came to power, and he was able to ride this wave for a full decade. And then for most of, and that allowed him to keep both the elite and the masses happy. And then after the annexation of Crimea, another policy that was wildly popular among the elites and the masses, Russia was able to take territory in a largely bloodless fashion. And there are a few things that make leaders more popular than that. However, Ukraine, by 2018 or so, the narrative had really stalled, right? And Russia had become kind of really stagnant. And this forced Putin to have to start to make some hard choices about what kinds of groups he was going to continue to reward and what kinds not. So, for example, the arrest of Alexei Navalny, the poisoning, the puzzle is not why was Navalny arrested, poisoned, put in jail, and ultimately killed. That's pretty common in autocracies to leaders who openly challenge the autocrat. And what needs to be explained is why Navalny was allowed to operate for so long and to so publicly, thumb his nose at very powerful figures. The general prosecutor of Russia was one target. Alisher Usmanov, a powerful business person, was another. Dmitry Medvedev and ultimately Vladimir Putin were all, targets of his exposés. And, I think that for a long time, Putin thought it was better to keep him, that he could balance out, the opposition and keep it marginal as long as the economy was doing well, the elites were happy, the masses were more or less satisfied. But by 2019 or so, the future looked like hard choices were going to have to be made ahead. And that's when we really see the clampdown on opposition politicians, opposition media, really take a full force. So the war hasn't removed the challenge of balancing, these two competing demands. In some sense, it's sharpened them.
And how far do you think Putin will go to win the war?
So again, it depends a lot on what Ukraine does and what the West does. One can see a scenario where he declares victory and says, as long as we can keep the 4 regions that we've incorporated into the Russian Federation and Crimea, we'll be satisfied at that for now. And what worries, I think, most observers is that, signing an agreement that allows Putin to declare victory would only allow him to regroup in the future for a time when the West is distracted, when perhaps there is a president in the White House who is much less sympathetic to Ukraine, to take another bite at the apple. Mm-hmm. So, Russia has signed agreements recognizing Ukrainian sovereignty that they violated. So there's skepticism that an agreement that allowed Putin these gains would satisfy him and be respected. Moreover, in Ukraine, while there's been increasing support for negotiations, there's very little support for giving away these 4 regions and Crimea, in part because Ukrainians see what life is like in the Russian occupied territories. And it's really pretty brutal. If you don't take a Russian passport, you're just denied all kinds of services and your life is basically hell. The levels of repression are significant because they recognize that these are occupied territories over a populace that doesn't want to be part of the Russian Federation. Even among the many Russian speakers in those regions, having witnessed, the brutality of the Russian army in the first, 18 months of the war, they quickly, turned to side with Kiev. So, there's not really a political space at the moment for an agreement, and there are concerns that a ceasefire would only allow Putin to lock in the gains that he's made. So it's going to take some real creative diplomacy, and perhaps a greater pushback against Russian forces, so that a deal could be struck where the Ukrainians would be satisfied that this is not just a temporary breather for the Russian armed forces, and on the Russian side, for them to be convinced that any further incursions into Ukraine would be so costly that they should be avoided at all costs. So unfortunately, I think we're still a ways away from a situation where there's political space for an agreement on the ground in Russia. But I think we're more likely to reach a stable peace that would last through time if it's clear to the Kremlin that the cost to this invasion have largely outweighed the gains.
Kind of thinking about foreign policy, we are seeing autocrats across the world kind of work together the stronger the opposition is against them. So we're seeing, because of all the sanctions, Russia's working a lot more closely with China, for example, to continue to get goods and arms and deals. So do you see that relationship between autocratic leaders giving them enough support to continue these kind of operations and have place globally in a political sense?
So I think the tightening of relationships between China and Russia is largely because it's advantageous for both parties at the moment. Um, because Russia can't sell oil and gas, coal, other goods to Europe and other manufactured goods in Europe, they've turned to India, China, Turkey to offload a lot of these goods. Now, there are two important points. One is the political returns from selling oil and gas to China and India are much lower than they were for selling oil and gas to Germany. The energy weapon, can be used in Europe to divide and conquer countries, because some of the countries within the European Union are really dependent on Russian gas supplies. And it makes good economic sense. Russia's the low-cost supplier of oil and gas to many of these countries. But you can't do the same thing with China, right? China has diversified its energy sources. And moreover, China is able to drive a much harder bargain than EU countries, and is getting the oil and gas at a discount that we didn't see the European countries getting. Finally, simply the transportation costs and the infrastructure needed to trade with China is much weaker than it is with Europe. Pipelines generally go west, highways generally go west, and it's a long way to China and to India, and simply the costs of engaging in this kind of trade also cuts into the margins. And I think that Putin and Xi have a very good relationship, but I don't think the Russians are under the illusion that China's relationship is kind of ideological, or that China will go out of its way to help Russia. China has also warned Russia about the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. They have been, skeptical of, the uncertainty that the Ukrainian war has generated in global markets. China's economy is also struggling at the moment. So autocrats are learning from each other. If you look, for example, at the way they use anti-LGBTQ legislation, foreign agent laws. A lot of these techniques are being adopted across autocracies. But in foreign policy, countries are going to choose their policies that follow their best interests. So China and Russia compete in Central Asia for influence and for markets. China has also made noise that it too is an Arctic power,
near Arctic power.
a near Arctic power. So, in a lot of ways, Russia and China have good relations, and there are, they've been brought together by the contingencies of the Ukrainian war. But on a lot of other dimensions, China and Russia still have this isn't an alliance per se. It is a partnership. It is a good. They have good relations with each other. They're not going to stab each other in the back or go out of their way to harm each other. But China's is not really willing to sacrifice in order to help Russia. They're doing very well. China's been the big winner from the Ukraine war. That's another way to put it.
Yeah. You mentioned that Putin, again, thought this was going to be a shorter war, and so it would be a way to kind of cement his legacy.
Yeah.
Now that it's taking a longer time, how long do you think he has kind of in office, or do you see that he feels like he needs this to be a win for him to kind of move on and have a replacement?
So, if we look comparatively, autocrats who stay in power longer than 20 years tend to stay in power for a long time. The personalist autocrat, the average length and term of office for a personalist autocrat that lasts 20 years is 36 years, which would be exactly the time from Putin's arrival in office in 2000 to his constitutionally mandated exit from office in 2036. So I think a lot of what I argue is that as a weak strongman, Putin faces all kinds of governance challenges. It's hard for him to get people to do things that they don't want to do. It's hard for him to keep the oligarchs in line. It's hard for him to keep the military from engaging in corruption. It's he's all kinds of difficulties. At the same time, it's hard to overthrow personalist autocrats, right? It's hard for the elites who are constantly being monitored to create a coalition large enough to overthrow Putin. It's hard for the mass public to engage in the kinds of collective action that are needed in order to bring down the government. We look at a leader like Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994. As long as the military is able to stay in power and the economy doesn't collapse, personalist autocrats can stay in power for a long time. One other thing I'll say is that, like Hemingway said, that people go bankrupt gradually and then suddenly. The same thing is true for autocrats when they lose power. It's often really difficult to predict when autocrats are going to lose power, because if we can predict it, if we can see it happening, so can Putin. So can the people around Putin. And Putin can take steps to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So it's highly likely that should Putin fall from power, it'll come as a surprise.
And kind of going back to the polling and in the big cities specifically, are you seeing that they care that they're being banned from certain events? Like the Olympics just happened, the athletes weren't allowed to represent them. are those, because of the war, those kind of effects on them? Is that having an impact?
So I think it's just part of, I think what concerns a lot of Russians, both elites and the masses, is just the increasing isolation of Russia and the recognition that, autarky, economic autarky and isolation from global society is not a formula for economic success in the 21st century. North Korea, Iran, these are countries, that don't have booming economies, that don't have, happy populaces. So, if you look at something like Russia's decision this past, few weeks to slow down YouTube, this is a big decision. YouTube has been the one form of social media, aside with Telegram, that have largely been, left untouched by the Kremlin, even as Twitter and Facebook and other forms of social media have been restricted and monitored, and people have to use a VPN to get access to them. YouTube has been widely used for entertainment purposes, for shopping, not just for television programs broadcast by the opposition. So I think, the decision to slow down YouTube and make it less accessible is just part of this broader trend that Russia's becoming more isolated, and the non-participation in the Olympics, in the World Cup, and in these other international events, I think does bother Putin, because prior to the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin went out of his way to hold the World Cup, to hold the Olympics, to be sure there was a Russian in charge of the International Chess Federation, and that Russia was very active in this sports washing activity to try to gain legitimacy by taking part in international sporting events. And that, since the full-scale invasion, that largely hasn't happened, except for, individual athletes, competing as neutrals, which is kind of embarrassing for a country like Russia that was, really a great sports power.
Unrelated, but Saudi Arabia is also doing tons of money into the sports investment, and it seems to be working. People are going over there for that.
Yes, and golf, golf tour being, a prime example.
So are you seeing any of that being enough, the isolation and not having access to certain things being enough for the people to eventually push back against Putin?
So I think the pushback is likely to come more quickly from, business elites who, I don't want to pity them. They've done quite well over the years, and but certainly their situation after the invasion, the full-scale invasion, and the imposition of sanctions is far less comfortable than it was before. And some of the economic oligarchs, have had to go back to Russia. Roman Abramovich and others have had to restrict their travel in ways. And I think things like the International Criminal Court bringing charges against Putin and making it hard for him to travel like a leader of a so-called great power does or should, is also very important to express normative opposition to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which was a violation of some of the most fundamental norms of international society, international law, it's the, first invasion on European soil since World War II that, was done with the idea of occupying a territory. So this is, really, unusual behavior that needs pushback from, the international community. And that's why I think, sanctions and sending weapons to Ukraine is so important, to send the message that, the behavior that was done so far is unacceptable, but also any kind of further incursions will be met, with similar levels of opposition.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, Russia does strong influence campaigns against the U.S. We also do influence campaigns towards Russia,
Right.
I'm sure. So given kind of your understanding of the population and how they're feeling, we have a question from Lou on what the West can do to increase the Russian people's understanding of actual consequences the war is having on Ukraine.
So a couple points is that the best thing the United States can do to help Russia become a more open, less corrupt, hopefully more, politically competitive, maybe ultimately a democracy, is to clean up our own mess at home. There's nothing that Putin likes to do more than say, "Oh, you want democracy? Well, January 6th, that's what democracy gets you, right? You want corruption? Well, look at Senator Menendez in New Jersey. Look at all these charges against Donald Trump. You know, uh, you want free elections? Well, look at all, Trump's charges of election fraud. So, the Russian people are smart. They uh, can see that, democracy is not as an attractive proposition as it was, 20 years ago, when levels of polarization and partisan rancor were much lower. If you ask Russians whether mayors should be elected, 85% of Russians say they should be elected rather than appointed, as they currently are. Even, governors as well. So, Russians put a value on free and fair elections. But when they see, disorder, homelessness, and when they see economic instability in the West, it dampens the attractiveness of the whole Western model of a market economy and democratic government. So being able to make a stronger case of the benefits of democracy, the best way to do that is by walking the walk and being a better democracy. Uh, you know, Short of that, I think that's the best thing that we can do. The other thing I think that is important, and I mentioned this before, is that not allowing Putin to walk away with an easy victory in Ukraine. To stand up for what is a young democracy, where for all of its problems, elections have produced turnover in government repeatedly over the last 30 years. Standing up for Ukraine, I think, is a wise policy for showing that the U.S. is willing to stand up for democracies elsewhere as well.
Great. Well, we are coming up here on our finish time, and we had a dozen more questions we couldn't get to. But I know we have people from Columbia, obviously, but a bunch of other schools as well. We all continue reading. So if you can give us some recommendations on either authors, podcasts, anybody to kind of continue learning and reading and staying smart on this issue.
Oh, so I mean, there's one thing that I emphasize in the book, A Weak Strongman, is that Russia is a terrific place to study autocratic government. There are few autocracies where you can do the kinds of public opinion polling that you can do in Russia. You're not doing this in Iran, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, certainly not, even Venezuela raises its own problems. Certainly it's become much harder because of the war, and whether or not the Levada Center will continue to exist into the future, I think is an open question. And it certainly has become much harder, but for a long period of time, we were able to do kinds of research that were, impossible to do elsewhere. So there's lots of academic research on Russia that's really worthy of reading. Sam Green and Graham Robertson have a really good book called Putin versus the People, which is another book that looks at support for the regime using public opinion surveys in a kind of different way. Joshua Yaffa's book on Between Two Fires, which is about the kinds of compromises that Russian citizens have to make to lead a fulfilling life while also not running afoul of the authorities, and how they balance those competing goals and live to keep their consciences clear. It's really a terrific book that profiles, 7 or 8 really remarkable individuals who have made different kinds of choices about the kinds of compromises they're willing to make with the Russian government. That's a book, I recommend. The Levada Center also has an English language webpage where you can get lots of information on Russian public opinion. So even as I subscribe to some Telegram channels, that are useful. Ekaterina Shulman has a very popular podcast. Sergei Guriev is often very popular on YouTube and in podcasts. Yuri Dud has a great interview program that I've liked to watch over the years. So the great drawback is the inability to travel to Russia. For many people on the sanctions list, Russia is not an option. The State Department has made it very clear that you travel to Russia at your own risk. So that has been one of the great losses of the invasion. So for 10 years, I ran a laboratory at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where I collaborated with Russian scholars, European scholars, and it was terrific. We put out a lot of great research, but once the war happened, we all exited and couldn't work anymore with Higher School of Economics as a state-run organization. So that's a small casualty. Ukrainians are certainly suffering far greater losses. Russians who oppose the war certainly face much greater consequences. But for me personally, that was a casualty. For 10 years we had a great operation going, and we had to shut it down. So.
Well, I just want to remind everyone we did record the event tonight, and we will be sharing it tomorrow. A link to the recording, and we're already getting questions. If you can share some of those resources, the book titles, the Telegram channels. So if you share that with us, we'll share that with everyone as well.
Okay, that's great. That's great.
And then last minute, turn it back to you. Any closing thoughts you have for us?
No. Not really. Russia's been a big part of my life. And as I look, it's tragic. What it's become. At the same time, the future is unpredictable. And it's always darkest before it gets even darker. So things may get darker for a little while longer. But Russia will continue to be a fascinating place to study. And here's hoping to a Russia that is less corrupt, better governed, and more at peace with the world and with itself. That would be a great thing for Russia. It would be a good thing for Ukraine. It would be a good thing for the world. So let's hope and all work for that.
A great way to end it. Thank you, Professor, so much for spending your evening with us. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and everyone have a great evening.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much.